it seemed like the New Year celebration happened, and the foreign policy establishment concluded that the United States is not just in a two-front war, preparing for a two-front war with Russia and China because of all of its interests in doing so, right? Curbing these rising powers to the east, making sure that China's economy doesn't surpass the United States's, making sure that an example like a socialist governance system with a market-based economy can't thrive because of how that is allowing other countries to assert their sovereignty, right? It doesn't want de-dollarization, doesn't want any of these things, and we'll get to this in the article. But it's not only because of that. It's because the situation, the landscape is not so favorable right now. Meaning that, as we have talked about on this channel a lot, the Ukraine proxy war is exactly that. It's a proxy war, but it's one that doesn't have any end in sight, right? And that's not a good position for the United States to be in, because the United States, sure, can continue to allow its contractors to make, all of these profits. It can continue to have Wall Street kind of finance this and become, into to loot Ukraine and all that. That's all good and fine. But the problem with the permanent war is that it can become a quagmire. It can become one that exposes the overextension and overreach of the U.S.'s capabilities. And that's exactly what the United States' foreign policy establishment is considering. You saw it in that article. You saw it when it came to the U.S.'s depleting military armaments, right? Its stockpiles. Its stockpiles are depleted, and they're worried about, the foreign policy blob are worried about the militarists. They're worried about not being able to fight elsewhere. So what does the foreign policy establishment do? Well, it's going hard on a propaganda war to build up to the next war, which is with China. The next war is with China. Ukraine is just the beginning. It's just the beginning. Russia is just the beginning. And so here I wrote on Substack, the U.S. is already preparing for the next war. We have war strategists, pundits, and experts setting their sights on China. So I talk about the Ukraine is turning 1 year next month. And mind you, this channel is going to have great guests, hopefully next month, to kind of go over this 1 year into the Ukraine proxy war. But nonetheless, Ukraine is turning one. This proxy war is turning one next year, at least the special military operation side of it. Of course, this started in 2014. But now you see that anything resembling victory, right? Winter's here, and Ukraine's prospects for victory are dissipating if they really ever existed. And so you had this incredible article by Condoleezza Rice. You remember her, right? Huge proponent of the war in Iraq. She served on Bush's National Security Council as Secretary of State for a bit. And then you have Robert Gates, who's been a CIA director. He's also been in the foreign policy establishment for a while. Both of them came together, and they were an op-ed for the Washington Post saying time is not on Ukraine's side and that the U.S. needs to act fast. And it needs to do this because neocon hawks like Rice and Gates cannot even imagine a negotiated settlement. They don't want a negotiated settlement. They can't even imagine such a thing. So the only option for the U.S.'s political and military establishment is to fortify Ukraine with the heaviest weapons. And so Brian Berletic, who will be on this show January 20th, and you can find his interviews with me in the past. He's a friend of the show and regular guest. The United States is burning through, right? So it produces about 30,000 rounds per year of 155 millimeter howitzer long range systems, and Ukraine has used those in 2 weeks of fighting. So in 1 year, this weapon alone, this weapon system alone, is being burned in 2 weeks by Ukraine. That's how bad things have gotten. And so, of course, Zelensky must have been disappointed when he went to Congress and Biden told him to his face. Well, actually, he was kind of turned away from him, but he basically presented to the crowd, to Congress, that no, I don't want to do anything that NATO doesn't accept, right? That NATO doesn't want to get into a a direct conflict with Russia, so I'm not going to give you more than the 45 billion I promised you, guy, right? Jack, as Biden would probably say. So, Russia's taking Soledar. They're getting ready to take Bakhmut. There's many battles happening right now where Russia's doing quite well on that front line. And the foreign policy establishment is worried that its capacity to wage war is being depleted elsewhere. And so no other issue is more important than China here. We have to understand that China is the big target. It's the big fish. It's the one that the United States wants to hit and hit the hardest, but understands in terms of the contradiction, that it's in no position to do so. But nonetheless, you've had, like the RAND Corporation, I said, a research arm of the Pentagon, has called China a peer competitor, meaning that it is not necessarily a rogue state, they say, but it's one whose competition is a direct threat, and it's the greatest long-term threat to the United States. Joe Biden's Secretary of Defense, former Raytheon board member Lloyd Austin, called China the greatest threat to the U.S.'s security. All of this happened. This happened this year. NATO labeled China a malicious actor in the alliance's latest strategic concept document, and that happened in June 2022 during the summit. And it pledged to play a larger role in curbing the so-called threats presented by China's rise. But I break down, and it's an incredible article, this article in Foreign Policy magazine that I cite here, where it blows off all the lids to the subtlety of this plan for war with China. It has 12 essays and contributions from all corners of the foreign policy establishment in the United States, including Obama CIA director and former U.S. Army commander in Afghanistan, David Petraeus, war criminal. You have another war criminal, NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, and former Undersecretary of State in Trump-era NATO Secretary General Rose Gottmuller. So you have basically NATO and this war criminal, not to mention a whole bunch of other unsavory characters that we'll get into. But these forces are leading the charge for calling for war with China, and it's mostly over Taiwan. But really what they're saying is we got to prepare for this bigger war with China. So they cover areas like cyber economic war, cyber war, military, direct conflict, diplomatic, and propaganda war. And so the big important thread here is that they want to spread the propaganda that not even the New York Times will spread right now, or at least they've tempered it a bit, where they're spreading that Russia has basically failed in Ukraine. But there's so many lessons that we can learn. So they want to say that Russia is weak and that Russia overplayed its hand and that Russia is on the verge of defeat. However, none of that is true. But this is the only way they can present the next war as being plausible. So this preparation for World War III is only plausible if Russia is made to look weak. And so Stephen Thiel, I'm sure I didn't look this up, but I'm sure he's a part of the big Thiel dynasty, this hugely wealthy family, but he's the chief editor, and he says, quote, drawing the right lessons from the first 10 months of the Russian invasion not only matters for Ukraine, it's also vital for deterring and preventing a future conflict and, if necessary, fighting one. The most obvious potential hotspot, and one that involves the greatest stakes, of course, is Taiwan. So there you go. That's how the article opens up into this 12-essay marathon on why the United States needs to go to war. And so you have this lip service to deterrence, which is incredibly disgusting in my view, because this is not about deterrence prevention. You have David Petraeus in his co-authored piece. He writes, this is a guy who has literally been in charge of bombing weddings and mosques in public, in civilian areas in Afghanistan, saying, he says, quote, Ukraine points to the imperative of the United States and its Indo-Pacific allies to prioritize the near-term ability to field large numbers of relatively inexpensive, highly mobile anti-ship and anti-air missiles that can be dispersed and maneuvered throughout the first and second island chains against Beijing's increasingly formidable naval and air forces. Large quantities of unmanned air, sea, and ground systems can amplify these missiles in the U.S. order of battle. So literally, this is military speak. This is planning for war with China. There's no doubt about it. And in other words, the U.S. is saying that it's David Petraeus is saying that the U.S.'s $858 billion military budget, which we know is much larger than that because so much money is unaccounted for, must grow even larger to challenge China. And he's a war criminal, and I just mentioned that, and I mentioned that in the article that he is literally responsible for killing women, children, men, and all human beings, civilians, in mosques, in weddings, just absolutely grotesque war crimes. But nonetheless, he's saying, well, we've got to move on to the next area where war crimes must be committed, and that is against China. So then you have the former NATO Secretary Anders Fogh Rasmussen backing up Petraeus, saying that, quote, weapons are what counts when it comes to Taiwan. With the help of its partners, Taiwan must become a porcupine bristling with armaments to deter any possible attempt to take it by force. China must calculate that the cost of an invasion is simply too high to bear. So essentially, right, again, war is peace, right? So if we can wage and escalate, basically build up to a war with China, China will less likely want to wage a war on Taiwan. This is how they like to speak. But of course, it's all imperial doublespeak for getting ready for this confrontation. So foreign policy war stenographers clarify that preparing for war with China is much more than just weapons. It's about much more than weapons. So you have Maria Shagina, a research fellow on sanctions at the Weapons Industry and State Department funded International Institute for Strategic Study, arguing that the U.S. and its allies should devise a coherent plan of economic statecraft against China as soon as possible. And let me just show you who or what I should say the International Institute for Strategic Studies is, because you may not have heard about it before. This is a think tank that is less known, but here we go. It's a less known think tank, and it's not often that people pay attention to it. But here you have a list of the funders, okay? Those who give sponsorship and royalties and membership funds to this. And look at the top funders here. This is basically the military industrial complex. Who do you see here? And let's see, is it too small? Let me see. BAE Systems, Boeing, General Atomics Aeronautical Systems, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. And then we can go to Northrop Grumman Corporation is in the second tier. And then you have Chevron, of course, the British Army, of course, right? A Japan Bank, of course. All right, you have just institution after institution, Dow Chemical of the UK. You go on and on and on. But nonetheless, the most important thing here is that you see that it is actually an arm of the military industrial complex, essentially. Those are the biggest funders, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, etc. So that's who we're hearing speak through the Foreign Policy magazine. So let me go back to the article now. And then you have Elizabeth Braw of the Carlyle Group funded American Enterprise Institute proposing that the U.S. and its allies should control information airwaves to ensure citizens, quote, know exactly what to look for, end quote, from so-called subversive state and non-state actors that counter U.S. and NATO talking points. And I said, these are already happening. These preparations have already happened in many ways. And they're just being escalated through calls like this, through articles like this. You may know the United States spends hundreds of millions of dollars, I believe up to $500 million on information warfare against China, funding the U.S. Agency for Global Media, institutions like Radio Free Asia, which is a former CIA cutout. You already have that information warfare going on, human rights atrocity propaganda, think Adrian Zenz. And then you also have sanctions on China already, whether it's on Huawei, right, the huge tech giant, whether it's on the trade war, or whether there's a whole blacklist of tech corporations, Chinese tech corporations that have been blacklisted. You also have human rights related sanctions on things like Xinjiang cotton, Xinjiang polysilicon, which has actually hurt the U.S. economy. But you also have these huge Chinese semiconductor export bans which really is very counterproductive. It only hurts the overall tech industry. But nonetheless, that's what's happening. And so these preparations that they're calling for, what they're really saying is we need to do more. We need this to get worse. So, foreign policy article is part of a flurry of indications that the U.S. foreign policy establishment is preparing for war with China. Just 2 days following foreign policy's article, top U.S. general in Japan, James Bierman, made the stunning admission in the Financial Times that the U.S. is setting the theater of war by goading China into a Ukraine-style war over Taiwan. The next day, the Center for Strategic International Studies released a war simulation between the U.S. and China over Taiwan. So again, war simulation. You have the top general in Japan saying, yeah, the United States, everything it's doing in the Asia Pacific is setting the theater of war with China. And we've already had conclusions like this come from, you've already had war simulations and tests and conclusions that this is going to happen from way back earlier in May of 2022 from the Center for New American Security, another Pentagon and think tank, Pentagon and arms manufacturer industry funded think tank, which went on NBC's Meet the Press and literally did a war simulation with the U.S. fighting China over Taiwan. And so, of course, it's always the conclusions are always, oh, this is going to be a bloody battle and everyone's going to lose probably, but China will receive a lot of damage, and that's great, right? That's kind of what you get out of the conclusions from these war stenographers. Nonetheless, I say it's important to note that this has very little to do with China. So you have all these preparations. You have the CSIS preparing for war with war simulations. You have top general James Bierman in Japan, U.S. general, saying, yes, we are setting the theater for war. When you set a theater for war, you are going to play, right? That's basically what he said. Asia Pacific, you've seen it. Militarization, 400 plus military bases, all of it, right? Aggressive postures toward China, sailing warships through the Taiwan Straits, South China Sea, on and on and on. We can go on and on and on. And then you had the foreign policy article literally gathering together the top war stenographers in these think tanks in the former foreign policy establishment, right? These veterans of war. You gather them all together and you have them tell you that you tell their readers and tell the general public, they're hoping, although I doubt many people read Foreign Policy Magazine, to be honest, outside of war enthusiasts, but they want to get out the message to who they're really writing to, which is the establishment, that it's time for war with China. And so this is not about Taiwan, even though they say Taiwan, got to protect democracy in Taiwan. What they really are responding to is imperial decline, their own decline, the collective West's unraveling, in the United States' decline in particular, and also the rise of China and Russia happening simultaneously. And so I say that Russia and China present their own individual challenges to U.S. hegemony. That is Russia's growing sovereignty and political independence, which goes in direct contradiction to the Wolfowitz doctrine post-1991, where you had a doctrine, the U.S. military strategy for Russia was not necessarily to wage war on Russia directly, but to weaken it so much so, fragment it so much so that it would never be able to assert sovereignty ever again. That is actually being challenged direly by Russia at the moment. And then you have China's massive socialist government-led market economy set to surpass the United States by 2035. So that's individually, right? And there's, of course, more than that. There's the fact that the United States is unable to meet the needs of its own people, so it has to project out to China and Russia in order to meet these geopolitical aims. And you also have the fact that China and Russia also do things their own way. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's also domestically, yes, Russia with its nationalized sectors around energy, right? It has big markets that the U.S. wants to get its hands on. Russia won't allow it. China the same way. China has nationalized markets, huge infrastructure sectors that are not touchable from Western and U.S. corporations. They can't dominate it. They can't suck it up. They can't eat it and spit it out. They can't privatize it. But worse, I think, is that Russia and China are growing closer together. in economic terms, you have a comprehensive strategic partnership between these two countries that has grown leaps and bounds since their 2001 Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation Agreement. Since that time, we've had a total volume of 200 billion US dollars being set as a trade target by 2024. That's ahead of schedule. And I think the number now is about 180 billion right now. And it's expected to increase bilateral trade, that is, to increase by 25%. So you have these surging economic ties helping Russia protect itself from EU sanctions from this war, the US and EU sanctions. And you have agriculture and energy exports to China from Russia increasing by the month. And you also have increased coordination between Russia and China on matters of things like military coordination, color revolutions, and diplomacy in the face of a common threat. So you have these two countries coming together in a common way to fight off and ward off the threat of imperialism. But the biggest threat here is not that, really. The biggest threat is that there's a global movement for integration and de-dollarization that China and Russia is leading. They're leaders in institutions like the BRICS Plus mechanism and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, both of which are setting the foundations for a dollar or free world, or at least a world independent of the US dollar. So what they do is they strengthen investment in all sectors of economic and social development between the partner nations with the ability to do so in their own currencies. So when you have starvation sanctions on Russia, predatory loans from Western financial institutions hurting the entire global South, you have BRICS Plus uniting these countries, the largest global South countries of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa, in an effort to really develop an alternative. You have the petrodollar being challenged because these institutions are expanding. So BRICS Plus in particular, right? It grew immensely last year. You had Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Iran, Argentina, and several other countries express interest in or directly apply, like Iran did, like Argentina did. And you have Saudi Arabia and Algeria on their way probably to join this BRICS Plus mechanism. And this has only complemented, so this is all connected. It's complemented these integration projects that Russia and China are leading on their own. You have the infrastructure. So you cannot just have a de-dollarized economy, world economy, without having independent infrastructure development. You need to build new economic institutions and new infrastructure from which those institutions can conduct and facilitate trade and economic relations. And that's what's happening. Belt and Road Initiative through China, right? It supports major cooperation agreements with nearly all of the world, 140 countries out of what, 189, 198? So nearly the entire world has signed on to this, with 2,000 development initiatives either completed or under construction. And you have talks now of possibly Russia's Eurasian Economic Union and the Belt and Road Initiative, the Russia's Eurasian Economic Union, including countries like Belarus, I believe is it Kazakhstan that's in that. It's a smaller arrangement, but it mainly focuses on the Eurasian Caucasus region as well as Belarus and some direct allies. But they're very similar projects about building infrastructure. And now they're talking about, Russia and China are talking about coming together and possibly merging these two initiatives. The corporate media used to say, the Western media used to say, oh, they're divided. These countries are divided. Well, think again. So the most interesting thing, I think, and then I'll conclude here, is that you have people like Zoltan Parsar, not just the Foreign Policy magazine, which in that essay I cited, did sound the alarm that U.S. sanctions are leading China and Russia to pursue alternatives to the dollar with its trading partner. We have this gentleman, Zoltan Parsar. He's an economist, a former strategist at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So he's a Wall Street guy. And he's saying that BRICS expansion, he literally uses this term, BRICS expansion, and the potential of China, Russia, Iran, and the global South uniting around a new currency system backed by the wealth of their own commodities in their possession is a real threat to the US dollar. He's saying that commodity encumbrance, he uses this term to say that there's a growing possibility of these resource-rich nations like Russia will actually use their commodities as finance, as collateral to increase credit and to increase their ability to invest. that you have China and Saudi Arabia interest in trading in Chinese yuan for oil and other commodities. You have Russia's pursuit of an international reserve currency actually underway. And you have this idea of a BRICS coin being floated about. And all of this is presenting a major threat to the future of the US dollar. In that, what he is saying is that it could lead to huge inflation. Because what will happen to the US dollar if alternatives start to kick in into the world economy is that creditors and financial institutions and major corporations trading in the dollar will begin to will begin to raise their prices due to a drop in demand, right? Because there will be less demand for dollars. So now it's time to drop. What has happened to Europe? Europe has been deindustrialized. Europe has been made vassals of the United States. And what has that done? Well, it's allowed the dollar to inflate because it has increased demand for the dollar by weakening the euro and weakening Europe's economy, ergo strengthening the US's economy, even if it is artificial, even if it is temporary, it nonetheless serves that function. So I say that the United States' answer to fading imperial hegemony here is war and more war. War and more of it. It's an inherent feature of this system of neoliberalism that the neocons oversee, of this neoliberal imperial system. It's a permanent and very profitable industry with the weapons manufacturers and Wall Street taking huge cuts of profits. And then you have the ruling elite calculating it cannot compete with China and Russia right now. And this sentiment has been expressed in the Atlantic Council think tank and in successive national security strategies of great power and strategic competition, that they can't compete. So it's time to militarily become more and more aggressive. And so this should come as no surprise because the US is not targeting singular enemies here. It's not just China. It's not just Russia. It's about this alternative development model that is emerging, that countries are joining onto in very different ways, maybe, but that's what multipolarity is. Everyone has their own maybe national development model that is respected. These countries aren't trying to change each other, but they are pursuing common goals, one of which is de-dollarization, diversifying the economic portfolio, asserting sovereignty, growing on their own terms, and shaking off U.S. diktats and also the burden of U.S. and Western financial institutions. So Ukraine is just a testing ground for this larger imperial agenda of stopping this. And so that's why they're planning for the next war, because they can't stop. If they were to stop and just say, let's focus on Ukraine for now, because it's first, because Russia is first, well, that would limit them. That would limit their ability to do what they need to do sooner rather than later, because this is also a war of attrition in that these countries like China and Russia, time is on their side. They have respected development models. They have public support. They have accomplishments that they can cite. They have legitimacy on the world stage. I've showed you the study that has been conducted. There are numerous studies like this, but there's a recent study that shows that more than 60-70% of the entire global South stands with Russia and China as partners. So Russia and China, time is on their side. They are on the side that's growing, dare I say, that's winning. And the United States is trying to wrestle back what it is losing, and it's not going to succeed, but it is threatening World War III, and that's what I wanted to get across. It is doing this. We have to understand that it is threatening World War III, and it's preparing for it as we speak. That's what's happening, and we have to push through the misinformation about this, because so much misinformation exists about this very phenomenon. And you have so many people who are not looking at each side of this. Some people look at Russia, others look at China. Both are important. They're interconnected. This is all interconnected. It is a two-front singular war against the emerging multipolar world, the emerging order led by the global South and led by its biggest and fastest rising powers, Russia and China, with China in the lead, and China being the most important for the U.S. foreign policy establishment and the collective West to destroy and to undermine. But it's not going to work, folks. We will see, though, possibly more escalations and maybe a great power confrontation, a global war. And I don't think anybody wants to see that because there's no way that cannot lead to a nuclear exchange.